I'm president of Concerned Citizens, and I welcome to all you members and guests. And we apologize for having this afternoon meeting as a speaker meeting, but it was very convenient for our speaker. You know, this group has been around, this group has been around since 1981, and there's still some of us who were in almost at the very beginning. And one is Margaret Perlman, who has just had her 100th birthday, and she's been very active in this group. Now, you know our dues are based on the calendar year. So individuals, $20, households, $30. Please see Betsy at our membership table if you have not already paid your dues for 2020, or if you wish to join as a new member, you're welcome. We welcome all. Now, this is unusual for a speaker in the afternoon. We regularly have a speaker the first Tuesday of every month, except July and August. Then on the third Thursday, today, we alternate between a documentary DVD and a special conference inspired by an important book.
Actually, if you wouldn't mind doing that.
And our regulars, I'm going to make 2 announcements for February. And then we have another brief announcement, and then we'll get started. I assure you I'm not going to take up much time, but so that you will know what's going on in February, I do have 2 events to describe. We have as the speaker Chairman Ryder, who's talking about reclaiming the justice in the criminal justice system. Dr. Ryder will focus on the unjust ways the America identifies and prosecutes and punishes criminals. Using examples introduced in California, he will propose reform that make the American criminal justice system more effective and more humane. Racial discrimination being a major feature of American injustice, this talk is especially appropriate in February, which is Black History Month.
What's better?
She's an expert on the effects of imprisonment on human behavior. The author of 2 books, The Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement and Mass Incarceration. She's written articles about supermax prisons, experimentation on prisoners, mental illness in prison, and gun control. She's an associate professor at UC Irvine School of Social Ecology. On the 3rd Thursday in February, here, it's the 20th of February, in keeping with Black History Month, we're showing the DVD 13th. Now that will be at 2 p.m. here at Clubhouse 1. The 13th Amendment, I know everyone knows, because we all had a good education, abolished slavery, or it was supposed to. This award-winning documentary explores consequence of the loophole in the amendment, the one that permits involuntary servitude as a punishment for conviction of a crime. This film's message is that since the Civil War, white Americans have used criminal conviction as a way of depriving African Americans of their rights. It runs 1 hour. These acknowledgments always appear in our newsletter, capably managed by Joel Goldstein. Go around the back. If you're a member and you receive this newsletter by email or regular mail, please feel free to forward it to others whom you believe might appreciate our programs. Sue Modell, our program chair, has a brief announcement, and then I will introduce Jonathan Adler, who will introduce our speaker.
Okay. I'm just making a brief announcement for those who are attending the march and who are on C.C. Sloan's bus. Okay, for those of you who aren't, you should be. And we expect to see you next year. So the bus is leaving at 8:30. We had said 8, but that was wrong. We've decided to move it up to 8:30 from the bus stop at Clubhouse 3, at Gate 3 behind the post office. If you are planning to come and you have signs, please feel free to bring your own signs. We also have signs, your choice. If you have a good one, you should bring it. Otherwise, we will have some signs for you. And lastly, we are also going to carry the Concerned Citizens banner. And it's actually fun to kind of go as a group. So if you would be up to it, we would like those of you that are strong enough to volunteer to join us. We're going to have brigades. We're going to carry the banner like 3 at a time because it's fairly heavy. You know, it's big. You've got these women and men marching, and it says Concerned Citizens. Very cool. So if you think you're up to it, please volunteer on the bus. You don't have to think about it till later. And join us in marching for Concerned Citizens and for an end to the current administration.
It gives me a pleasure to introduce Jonathan Adler, who's actually a jack of all trades, and he's going to be introducing our speaker, Robert Scheer. Please welcome Jonathan Adler.
I think a jerk of all trades could have been more accurate, right? So this is Robert Scheer's 21st appearance before Concerned Citizens. So I know that everybody knows him, so he needs no introduction. So, but for the 3 people in the room that don't know him, he's one of America's most distinguished journalists. Those of us who are old enough remember his writing from Vietnam, from Cuba, and from other hot spots. And if you're not old enough to remember that, he still wrote from Vietnam and Cuba and other hot spots. We remember him as a editor-in-chief in the very, very early days of the great magazine Ramparts. Remember that? And we remember his 25 years as an LA Times reporter, correspondent, and opinion writer. And for those of you who don't remember, he did write for the LA Times. So he also is the founder and editor-in-chief of truthdig.com. I just wonder how many of you see that website. A lot of people. And Sheer Intelligence is a podcast hosted by KCRW. He is a professor at USC. I'm a UCLA fan. It's very hard for me to say that. But USC, Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism. And just curious, if you have heard Bob Scheer speak to Concerned Citizens at least 10 times, let me see how many of you are back for that. Okay, so please give a warm welcome, Robert Scheer, everybody. Did you say quiet your cell phones? Did you say that, Pat? Yeah, you did? And we will have Q&A after Bob has said a few words, and it'll be lining up at the center microphone. For anybody who can't make it to the center mic, raise your hand. We'll bring you a wireless. Thank you.
So you want me to sit here, or is this better than standing, or?
Wherever you want. Sit wherever you want. You can stand, you can sit.
I think I'll try standing, yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. All right, I'm always nervous when I speak here, and I remember one time very early in my career, I know I'm not allowed to call it Leisure World, right?
Right.
I'm sorry.
Laguna Woods Village.
There's so many words you can't use anymore, but I always liked the idea of trying to find a time in my life when I would have some leisure. And when I came here as a young man, I think of Leonard Cohen. You all know Leonard Cohen, right? And that great London concert. He said, the last time I was here, I was just 60 years old, just a kid with a crazy dream. That was me at Leisure World. I think I was 62 or 61. And believe it or not, I was actually living in Orange County at some point, my life in exile. And I remember one time I said something, I didn't think it was so provocative, and half of the audience stood up, waved goodbye, and left. And I said, what the hell is going on here? What did I say? And they said the magic thing, the buses are leaving. So I learned to accept rejection at an early age in this thing. And there's another thing Leonard Cohen said, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets through. And there's a contradiction. And we obviously live in very contradictory times. And I want to talk about it not necessarily as the worst of times, or certainly not the best of times, but the contradictions and the need for action, the need for thought. But in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And as I was sitting here, and it's very strange, because last night I was sitting in front of 19 and 20-year-olds. And I teach at USC, and last term I had 167 people. I don't know how large this crowd is. And I have to remember that I can't mention the Korean War without explaining there was one and what happened. And even, of course, Vietnam seems like distant history. And I was thinking, you know, we're in unusual times, and the topic I've been given is Trump. And let me just be clear. I do think Trump is a neo-fascist and his immigrant bashing and his scapegoating. So this is before you end up booing me. But I also am not here to do the Trump washing, which I think is very popular with Rachel Maddow and others, in that all the sins, there's life BT and after T. And all of the crimes and sins and everything that happened in the era before Trump is now forgiven. The FBI that tried, by the way, Monday is Martin Luther King Day. Remember, it was the FBI that tried to get King to commit suicide, frame him, blackmail him, smear him, spied on him, but now people talk to the FBI like it's virtuous. The CIA, which interfered in every election in the whole post-war period, is now a trusted source about whether Russia interferes in our election. Let me tell you, I wrote a book called They Know Everything About You. I do know quite about the surveillance state, and there isn't anything, any country in the world that can do that to interfere in an election that comes close to the US level. Even before the internet. Go back to the Italian election of 1948, okay? So there's a certain renewed innocence. And my view of my life here on this planet is that the great enemy of our thought process, our sense of freedom, is a false sense of patriotism and American innocence. And I know George Washington is not as much in fashion as he was when I was young. Well, I went to Christopher Columbus High School in the Bronx. I dare not even mention his name, Columbus, but still, you know, we did march in the Columbus Day Parade and everything. And one thing that I cite often about George Washington, any of you ever read his farewell address? You did. Do you remember the great line in it? Come on, it's on the test, beyond the midterm. What did George Washington say about patriotism? You don't know. Beware the impostures of pretended patriotism. My dear countrymen, here is the great war hero, the general turned president, and like Eisenhower, the general turned president, warned us about militarism and false patriotism. Beware the impostures of pretended patriotism. Our lives have been gripped by a notion of American innocence and pretended patriotism. And so therefore, we never commit war crimes, we don't do torture, we don't overthrow regimes, we make mistakes occasionally, but they're mistakes of innocence and good intentions gone awry. Right? And what Trump represents is the ultimate of that American conceit, that arrogance. Okay? He's not the inventor of it. He's not even the worst practitioner. And indeed, there's something, saving grace to Donald Trump is that he's so ill-mannered and boorish and obvious and disgusting and everything else that we actually have a press doing what the press was supposed to do but failed to do for the last 50 years, which is take a serious look at a president as he moves us to war. Not done in the fake news times when the Gulf of Tonkin, when Lyndon Johnson, knowing full well, and Robert McNamara lied to the American, you didn't turn it off, lied to the American people about the second Gulf of Tonkin attack as an excuse. That's not me, is it? No. Okay, just don't get up and go for the buses yet. I'm not. All right. But I just want to stress there's a theme, and I was reminded sitting there, I thought, you know, I tried to get my mother to move here, okay, for years. And my mother was a garment worker in the Bronx, and she felt she couldn't leave the Bronx until she finished her 65th year as a garment worker, and then she would get her Social Security, and she didn't want to endanger that and her great union pension. And unfortunately, she wasn't in the Teamsters. She was in the Garment Workers Union, and her pension was, I think, $53 a month. And then with Social Security, my mother would have been a bag lady in the good old days. And so instead, I was able to convince my mother to come out to California. She had been here once before, by the way. She had picketed the LA Times back in 1931, trying to support them to get a union and not to be so hostile. This is the good old days of the LA Times, the responsible free press that we celebrate now. And my mother stayed here a year, lived in Boyle Heights, and then went back, thought it wasn't civilized enough and it had to be in the Bronx. But I remember one time my mother was living with me in Irvine. In 1984, I wrote an article about Richard Nixon for the LA Times. And I was, again, not in love with Richard Nixon. I had had my taxes audited. I had gotten enough of my files to know I had been followed as editor of Ramparts and elsewhere. I understood the dark side of Richard Nixon, but I thought as a journalist, my job is to constantly challenge my own prejudice and thought. And so I decided it was, you know, after his downfall, he was sitting in New York in his office, and I thought, well, I'm going to do a reevaluation of Richard Nixon. And I found out, you know, Richard Nixon did some horrible things, some of the worst war crimes, certainly the bombing of Cambodia, mostly was an extension of what the Democrats had done. We forget. We've whitewashed the Democrats totally. They've always been the center of progress. Just the other day, I was in the Maui airport. I know I'm going to ramble and everything, but what the hell? You don't have anything else to do you? No. Okay, so let me just paint a broad landscape here. I was in the Maui airport and waiting for my plane, and there's an exhibition of how Hawaii became a state. And the first serious effort to get it statehood was 1950. So I went through all these murals, reading it, and then I read this thing where it didn't happen in 1950 because some people called the Dixiecrats opposed Hawaii's entrance, right? And then they explained it. So I asked people nearby, I said, you know what these Dixiecrats were? You ever hear of them? Oh, okay, no one knew. Well, the Dixiecrats were the heartbeat of the Democratic Party. Right? The South, segregation, right, was supported most enthusiastically and consistently by the Democrats, these great Democrats, right? And these are the people who didn't want Hawaii in the state. Why? Because there were too many non-whites, right? That was the reason. So it was just a refresher course in the current view that somehow all virtue resides with one partisan position. And then I thought back, you know, others. I won't go through the whole history. But anyway, when I was trying to evaluate Nixon, by that point, I was kind of accepting of the idea that much evil could be associated with the Republican Party. The moderates were gone, Johnson was gone, Nixon's Southern strategy was quite vicious. That's where we got the whole revival of the religious right and everything. But I went and looked at the record. And there were really some surprising contradictions. Nixon, as you probably well know, the reason there were trade negotiations with China, right? The reason we have come to accept that you can be a commie and a capitalist all in the same moment. Remember, we tortured the whole world over a denial of that very position. There was a theory, there was something called communism that was inherently internationalist, inherently aggressive militarily, bent on the conquest of the world, and bent on denying our freedom, by which we defined the freedom to shop. Right? Because if they had been good at shopping, we would have identified them as a free society. Right? So we had this theory, a theory believed by the wisest among us, the best and the brightest, rarely challenged. False from day one. Communism was never internationalist, it was nationalist from day one. It didn't follow any ideas from Marx, which was supposed to come after the development of capitalism. It came as an alternative to it. Remember, the Communist Manifesto paid tribute to capitalism for ending the idiocy of rural life and building the great cities and companies. I remember once I reviewed Gorbachev's book when I was still working for the LA Times. I had gotten an advance copy, and I was in Moscow on loan to Moscow News and some other newspapers and institute, and they asked me, we reviewed Gorbachev's book. And so I was very pro-Gorbachev. That was before the US backed Yeltsin to get rid of him. And that's how we got Putin, by the way. I'm not going to go through the whole history. But we now have red baiting without a red, and everybody forgets that Putin came from the old Leningrad, St. Petersburg crowd. He was a reformer. Yes, he had been in the KGB. That's where a lot of intelligent people ended up. But the fact of the matter is, Putin came to Moscow in order to bail out this drunk Yeltsin, who we were backing as the great freedom person. And then when Yeltsin proved to be hopelessly drunk and incapable of even being a front man, they turned to Putin. And that's how Putin got to be head of Russia. Okay? So we have red baiting without reds. Okay, that's the thing, and a totally irrational exercise, and once again, imposing our own needs and prejudice on it. But nonetheless, there I was when Gorbachev was the bravest, one of the bravest people to ever hold office in any society. And this guy says, hey, you know, not only does the emperor have no clothes, I have no clothes. Nothing works, and I'm going to tell you the truth, and the last thing people in any country ever want to hear is the truth. And so he becomes an embarrassment, and they get rid of him. But when I was reviewing this book, I put in that quote that I just gave you from the Communist Manifesto. I said, this all wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to happen in a society of affluence that we shared and so forth. And so Igor Yakovlev, a great guy, nonetheless said, oh, that wasn't in the Communist Manifesto. And I said, yes, it was. I said, do you have a Communist Manifesto? He said, no, I can't find one. So I went running around Moscow, and my Russian is very meager, to try to find a Communist Manifesto. This is under the Soviet system, mind you. And I finally found a French edition. And I rushed back to Igor Yakovlev and I said, you have to print my review the way I wrote it, because here it is in the Communist Manifesto. He read it and he said, well, I guess you're right. And they let it in. Okay? So what I'm saying is there was a mythology about the enemy. There always is, whether it's a Muslim enemy, a communist enemy, what have you. And enemies are for the reasons that George Orwell explained and Huxley. They're necessary to a certain kind of totalitarian control. Whoever wants to exercise it, you have to have an enemy. In 1984, of course, the enemy is interchangeable from season to season. And we had, after World War II, this convenient enemy called communism. Now, sometimes enemies have deplorable characteristics, not denying that. But as a child, and I think I've said this before here, the big shock in my life, and the reason I'm still babbling away at this advanced age, by the way, how many of you are older than 84? Oh, I wasn't gonna be so successful when I referred to you as the kids, but I will be 84 in April, so I finally made it to senior citizen status. Okay, I'm one of you. I'm one of you. So I think of how did my life go the way it did, and what happened was in 1936, when I was born in the middle of the Depression to these garment workers, and by an accident of cultural life and everything, my father had left his family temporarily to be with my mother, and I was the issue. So I ended up with a German Protestant father and a Russian Jewish mother, and I was born in 36, and I have spent most of my life, and half of my family in Germany, in New York were German, heavy accents, and half my family were Russian Jews, heavy accents, and I knew enough about what was going on. You know, we had, you'll all remember, Gold Star mothers and honor rolls. We knew the war, we knew the reality of it, and so forth. And I was born into a question. And it concerns the whole course of civilization. Where does evil come from? Is it the work of the devil? Is it the work of different ideologies? Is it the work of psychiatric motivations, or what have you? And where does it come in politics? And the main conceit or arrogance of American society is somehow it always comes from the other, some other society, some foreigner, and so forth. And as a kid, I was visited with this question, because the Germany that my relatives knew, my father had come after World War I, but others had come more recently, and so forth, was actually largely in this society the most respected country. It had probably the highest level of education, or if not the highest, one of the highest, certainly had a very high level of science, right? And certainly had a high level of technology, engineering, certainly music. You could go down the list, certainly a sense of order and cleanliness, and even Christianity, right? And we're white. What could be better? What could be more admired? What could be more civilized? What could be more decent, right? To be emulated. And yet, that white, Christian, smart, heavily educated society is the one that committed the greatest barbarism in modern history. Well, as even a kid, I couldn't quite understand it. Why does my father's family, who all seemed so nice and reasonable and decent, and back in Germany, killing my mother's family? And then, as a young person, as a young writer and everything, I went to Germany, I don't know, 20 times or so forth, found my father's brother. He'd been in Stalingrad. He was wounded fighting the Russians. Russians then were our allies. So he was not a freedom fighter, the way we defined everyone else who subsequently fought Russians, including bin Laden and those people. You know, it was a real mystery. And what is a bigger mystery is that after the war, there was hardly a pause to consider what had happened. And instead of, and I think I've mentioned this before, it came home to me, my mother, in order to get me to eat spinach before I ate my dessert, would divide the meal up. And she would define, okay, dessert as the Russians, and spinach as the Germans. So I demolished the Germans first, you know, and moved on, and then got the dessert, you know, reluctantly ate the Russians. And I remember that. And then, a rather short period of time, without any serious examination, the Russians became the spinach. And the Germans were suddenly reinvented. They were helping us with these things called nuclear weapons. Right? And they were helping us in other ways, and we were doing favors for them, and their economy would come booming back, and we would do a lot of business. And in fact, some of our companies that had been with them very close to the apocalypse were back in business. And then some of the companies, the German companies that had supported this funny little maniac, Hitler, they were back in business. And for a while, we didn't buy Mercedes or BMWs, right? They were. I remember once I spoke to, I think it was, I forget which is the fanciest private school in West LA. It's not Brentwood. It's one of those. Harvard Westlake. And I couldn't get the attention of the students at all with my political crap, you know, whatever. They weren't interested. It's junior, I don't know what level they were. And so finally I thought, well, I got to ask a provocative question. So I said, how many of you came to school today in a Nazi staff car? there were blank stares, and then I identified the origin of the Mercedes-Benz and the BMW, and every hand went up. I said, why don't you discuss that with your parents tonight at dinner? Which they did, and I never was invited back to Harvard. Westlake. But as a kid, I remember being incredibly perplexed by all this. How did we get the substitution of enemies so quickly? How did it happen? Why was there no real examination of what had gone before? Real examination. Where did this fascism come from? What was it all about, you see? And instead, we were off to a new race. And so recently, for those of you who have not read Truth Dig, go to it just for no other reason than to read or listen to my podcast with Noam Chomsky. And in that podcast, Chomsky, and I got the second part going in tomorrow, and I have not been close to Chomsky. I've read him extensively, but not since I interviewed Bertrand Russell. Chomsky's now 92. I had gone to interview Bertrand Russell when he was 94, turning 95. And by the way, if you want to know another example of fake news, the reason I went to see Bertrand Russell, I assume you all know who Bertrand Russell is. Yeah, none of my students do, but that's okay. And that's not their failing, it's the failing of the school system. But at any rate, I went to see Bertrand Russell, who was living in Wales, because the New York Times and other mainstream journals were involved in smearing him, the way old people are smeared. He was supposed to be senile. Alzheimer's wasn't used as frequently. Why was he senile? Because he had had a war crimes tribunal with Jean-Paul Sartre on U.S. crimes in Vietnam. Because previous to that, he'd been very concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons and had the Aldermaston in March. And yet, Bertrand Russell had been a very strong anti-communist, one of the first prominent anti-communist, strong anti-communists before Kessler and others. So that was perplexing. How could you be a strong anti-communist because you believe in freedom and individualism and yet be against the U.S. in Vietnam? How could you be against our developing more nuclear weapons and bombing innocent Japanese farmers and fishermen? Which is the greatest act of terrorism in human history, if by terrorism we mean killing civilians as collateral damage. There's been no other single act of terrorism that compares to Hiroshima or Nagasaki. None. None. No military significance. I'm not going to give that whole lecture. But the fact that it's not examined is what I'm getting at. The fact that we can turn on a dime. The fact that we can define human rights or genocide or torture at our will to our convenience, okay? So Chomsky came up with an idea that I found really interesting that's in our podcast. I say I've met the man and I read all his work, but I went to interview him because I wanted to see if Chomsky was still on his game. Because some people say he's just too sharp and too prolific and there must be others, robots, Russian robots writing his script, and I was really curious. And in the discussion period, something had happened around Israel. I know a topic that doesn't interest you at all. Well, I will tell you. Susie Linfield, somebody I know, had written a book on Israel and its critics called From Hannah Arendt to Noam Chomsky. Have any of you seen that book? It's not, I don't think you have to read it. But what was interesting about it is all of the people except one in that book were Jewish. And all of them had started out as Zionists. Okay? And so I did this podcast with Susie Linfield, and in a rare lapse, and I really mean that, I pride myself on reading every page and every word of every book, and watching every documentary that I do. I do it out of insecurity. I assume I'll look like a fool if I don't do it, so I do it. In the case of the Arendt to Chomsky book, I fell asleep in the Chomsky chapter. And by then, the clock was ringing, and I had to get to KCRW, and I had to do this interview with Susie Linfield. And so I skimmed it, And I really didn't pay much attention to Chomsky. I was talking more about Hannah Arendt and everything, and the interview. And then I got a note from Chomsky saying, very interesting podcast you did, but the book is horribly incorrect, and you don't mention that, but that's okay, life is life. And I then reread the chapter, and it's a Yale University Press book, and I realized, looking at the footnotes and everything, it was a pretty shoddy treatment of Chomsky. So I wrote back to the man, I said, I really apologize. And I'd like to make amends by interviewing you on this subject. So we did that, and I did the interview, and that's how my whole two-part thing. But what's interesting about that, again, is does any of it really matter? Do we want to get it right? And so one of the things that Chomsky said in my interview with him that I found very provocative, he quoted a great biologist. First of all, one was Huxley's brother, and then I forget the name of the other one. And he said, you know, intelligence, smarts, so-called, is actually a lethal weapon against the survival of the species. I said that correctly? In other words, all the things we're testing people to do, be good on the SATs, get good results, be smart, get the degrees, all this stuff does not really contribute to the survival of the species. And he pointed out most species last about 100,000 years. Human race has probably gone around 200,000. But he said the fact is we don't have a snowball chance in hell of doing as well as the beetle or the cockroach. Right? And they survive by not being too smart by this standard. They have their niche. They know what they're doing. They certainly know how to reproduce. If you've ever fought cockroaches in the Bronx, I used to raise them and have pets. They're quite prolific in reproduction. And he made an interesting argument. And at first you recoil and say, that can't be true. Being smart must be helpful to the evolutionary process. How could it be negative and lethal even? And then you think of David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, right? And you'll see there's method to my madness now. I'm backing into my analysis of the current president, okay? And what the reality is that most of the damage that we have inflicted on the world has been committed, created, justified, rationalized by people who by standardized testing seem to be very smart. McNamara, for instance, was a whiz kid, a genius by some definition. The stupidest defense secretary we ever had, by his own admission. If you actually read his memoir, which I did discuss on the McNeil-Lehrer program that he was on, and that's another program I've never been invited back to. It's good to be fired, by the way. If you have grandchildren, tell them the best way to have an interesting life is put yourself in a position to get fired. It really is a clarifying experience, okay? And I've been fired by some of the best organizations, and who knows, maybe I'll even be fired by a few more before I kick off. But the interesting thing, there's no question, and I've interviewed a lot of these people, you know, and the smartest people stop thinking or lie or say the dumbest things, you know. After all, I mean, I don't know how much you know about my own journalism, but one person I got really angry with me was the first President Bush, who had a reputation, as opposed to his son, for having a brain, and been head of the Central Intelligence Agency, ambassador, China, you know, blah, 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 and yet said one of the dumbest things anyone has ever said to any reporter about the survivability of nuclear war. And that knocked him out of the race. It made the way for Ronald Reagan, who wasn't dumb enough to say that. You know, he thought you could defend and have Star Wars, but he didn't say you could actually survive an all-out nuclear war. And so the point I'm trying to make is if you're hanging your critique on Trump being dumb, boorish, ill-mannered, crude, and that's your critique, okay, you're making a mistake. First of all, he's dumb in lots of ways, but not obviously in his capacity to survive politically. And so let me just mention that reference to Nixon and my mother. And then I'll lose the rest of you by trying to answer the question of this forum about whether Trump is a symptom or the cause. In 1984, I wrote this tortured piece in the LA Times. And you probably remember the old LA Times where you could go on for whole pages inside. It was our attempt to mimic the Eastern media. So I spent a lot of time on it. I read everything about Nixon and so forth. And I pointed out, actually, in some things he was more moderate. The EPA, for example, since it's being destroyed at any moment, was, of course, his invention. He embraced the notion of a guaranteed annual income. Came from Patrick Moynihan, who was at one point his domestic advisor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He did have the opening to China, right? For the first time. Remember, there used to be an argument, we can't recognize Red China, right? We can't let them have their seat in the UN, right? They are so virulent, they are so expansionist, they are so set in their ideological ways, right? You can't possibly do business with these people, right? That was the argument. And they're internationalists. Well, of course, they turn out to be the best capitalists in human history. That's the irritation right now. I mean, that's what, come on, let's cut to the chase. An agreement has just been signed. And what are we really saying? First of all, Trump blinked big time. Big time. As he often does, by the way. It's his, I think, saving grace, if you'll permit me to say that. But this deal is a recognition that China will be the leading economic power in the world. And it's an acceptance of it as a norm. And all this crap about they steal stuff or they cheat or they inflate currency, we who have controlled the world currency through the dollar. I mean, right? Talk about currency manipulation? I'm sorry, I lost you already because I said I might have hinted there's something positive about Trump. So let me get back to my mother, because it relates. So I wrote this article. No one liked my article, right? I think because it was complex and brilliant and wonderful. Others thought it was tortured and stupid and besides the point. But I painted a mixed picture of Richard Nixon. Okay? Certainly talked about his war crimes and so forth, and Southern strategy, opened the door to the religious right. I was not kind. I had been in Cambodia as early as 64. I'd been there after the bombing, went for Microsoft in the middle 80s. I knew about the genocide. I knew our primal role in it. I'd been in North Vietnam. I've been everywhere and so forth. So I was not innocent, naive, or indifferent. But I also thought the opening to China was absolutely brilliant and something no Democrat would have done. They would all be afraid of being red-baited. And it was a recognition that China was a complex society and a nationalist society. That was the main thing, to try to recognize the obvious, that communism was not an internationalist ideology. It was an inherently nationalist ideology. That's why Yugoslavia split away. I could go down the list. That's why the Sino-Soviet dispute preceded the rise to power of the communists. That nationalism, ethnic identity, religion, history, all of these things factored in every single communist country in the world. I remember I interviewed Fidel Castro and the night that the Russians went into Czechoslovakia. And I spent the whole evening, believe it or not, I know this is name dropping with a vengeance, but I'm sorry, it's also true. So I was with this commie leader, who of course wasn't a commie when he was opposed to Batista, and he actually was at odds with the Cuban Communist Party until 6 months before he took power. But facts don't matter, and truth doesn't matter. And in fact, we drove Castro into this direction, because Castro obviously was a Cuban nationalist. So much so he broke with Che Guevara, who had more Trotskyist notions of permanent revolution, and died in Bolivia as a result. But I was sitting there with Castro, and clearly he was not on the side of the Soviets intervening, because he didn't want them intervening any more than they did in Cuba. and he obviously is a nationalist, and so forth. So this was a reality that Nixon in his foreign policy recognized ever since he had his kitchen debate, you know, back in the old days with Khrushchev. He understood it, he wrote about it, and the way I endeared myself to Nixon, before I met him, was in my article, I said, Kissinger is giving credit for this opening to China, but Nixon actually advocated this idea in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine before he ever knew Kissinger and before he ever was president. And there's no question it was Nixon's idea. And it came from his experience as vice president, traveling and meeting these people, and that you can do business with them, and you can live with them, and you can work with them, and win them over with your goodies, you know, your products, and so forth. And so that, anyway, I'm jumping ahead of the story, but that's why he ended up liking my article, even though I called him a war criminal, and so forth. So there I am in Irvine, a center of enlightenment. I mean it seriously, it was built that way. You know, the planned cities, you know Irvine, right? The bubble, as the kids used to refer to it. And the only human being that I know will read my article from beginning to end is my mother, who is, by that point, my age now, 84. Only she had Parkinson's and everything, and was much more frail. And she's got her glasses down at her nose, and she's all of about 60 pounds or something. And she's reading it very carefully, takes her 2 hours. And at the end of this, I say, she puts it down, and so I said, "So Ma, what do you think?" And she looks up at me and says, "He needs you." And the reason I'm giving you that answer is that's what you're going to say when you walk out of this room. You're going to say, "Trump needs you." Because what I'm here to do is introduce a notion of complexity and thought and debate. If all I had to do is come here and trash Trump, you know, I didn't have to worry about whether the 5 was better than the 405. And how the hell am I going to get home before 9, 10 o'clock, you know? Because I've been here before, okay? So, and I'm not going to pander to that view. I'm going to try to raise a series of questions, and hopefully don't run out of time. Give me another 15, 20 minutes to do that. Because I think it's understating this moment of risk to do the Trump bashing and leave it there, okay? And it's cathartic, I know. And I know the people I live with, my brother-in-law, my wife, Kay, who drove me down there, they denounce me every morning at breakfast, okay? Because they show up at breakfast with every bit of news that's nasty to Trump. And then my role, presumably as a journalist, but also as an intelligent human being, is to point out some contradictions in what they're saying, okay? No, the immigration crisis did not start with Donald Trump, nor is his policy necessarily the worst, okay? First of all, the immigration policy started with the genocide against Native Americans. And if you want to read a wonderful book about it, just read Benjamin Madley, who teaches at UCLA, on the California genocide in the late part of the 19th century, when babies, Native American babies, were thrown into the fire. As reported, everything in his book was reported in the local press at the time. Okay, major study. So the elimination of Native Americans, the genocide, is the beginning of our immigration policy. And the assumption that any recent white Northern European immigrant was entitled to all the blessings of this undiscovered, virginal, unpopulated land, which it wasn't, began there. And as Dolores Huerta points out about the Mexican immigration, she's been here for, I think, 5 generations. And she said, "I never crossed the border crossed me." Of course, most of the Mexican immigration problem has to do with the destruction of part of Mexico. And then the need for cheap labor and the cynicism that went with it, okay? And I covered immigration for some 30 years off and on for the LA Times. When Leonel Castillo was our INS commissioner under Jimmy Carter, I was at the border. I was under the border, I think, almost every president, you know? And anybody who tells me that the building of the wall is the worst thing to come up with in relation, they don't understand the issue. The issue about the border was, first of all, beginning with the quotas, when we said that the quota for Iceland will be the same as the quota for Mexico. And you had these quotas for white countries that were totally underutilized. And then you'd say Central America, Mexico, places that have historic connections, we're going to have a sound immigration policy with that kind of quota, unreasonable. When you have families on both sides, when you want the workforce. And then we came up with the idiocies of Bracero programs and what have you. But it's not just Mexican Americans, of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act. How many people even here know that a Chinese male could not marry in the United States until 1943 or become a citizen? We only recognize the Chinese as human beings when they turned out to be our allies in World War II. This is after we recognized the Japanese as being all traitors and enemies and put them in camps. Okay? So the immigration policy, the attitude towards the other has always been deeply informed by racism, economic greed, who you needed to work for you, double standard, exploitation on every watch. And then a deal was made. The deal was, let's look the other way and have programs of accommodation. Let's let some in, let's not enforce the law, let's have temporary passports, let's not go into the fields. And the last time I covered an immigration policy that meant anything at all went under a name that you probably never heard of, the TIP program. Never. No one here knows it. Pete Wilson. Pete Wilson was governor, and Pete Wilson, by the way, was a liberal Republican before he became a right-wing Republican. Does anybody remember that? You know, over immigration problem. Yeah, he was the mayor of San Diego, and people liked him, and he was enlightened and wonderful and everything. Well, anyway, out of total opportunism, he became a right-winger. But on that journey, he made the mistake of asking a woman named Victoria Bradshaw to be his Secretary of Labor. And Victoria Bradshaw had been a department store executive and was a reasonable, enlightened human being. A lot of these politicians make the mistake of turning to enlightened, reasonable women because they think they're not going to do anything nasty, and they turn out to be an embarrassment. One of them was Brooks Lee Bourne. Any of you ever hear of Brooks Lee Bourne?
Yes.
No? You did. Who was Brooks Lee Bourne?
I went to grammar school with her.
Huh?
I went to grammar school with her.
You're kidding.
Oh.
In San Francisco? And her father was a school board superintendent or something? Tell us about Brooks Lee Bourne. I mean, did you follow her career through Stanford?
No, I didn't hear of her until she hit the news with
well, she was head of the commodity. Okay. Brooks Lee Bourne was the first woman editor of the Stanford Law Review. And you just have to, you could make me a scholar in residence here. Really. I'll just sit here and tell stories late into the evening at some campfire. But anyway, Brooks Lee Bourne is a great story and relates to Victoria Bradshaw. So Brooks Lee Bourne they thought they were going to bring a woman in to be Attorney General, and then she was involved in the Bar Association with Hillary. She had been the first woman editor of the Stanford Law Review. She was brilliant, and she actually understood about banks and commerce, and she worked for big banks and big law firms and so forth, and they were going to make her Attorney General, but then Janet Reno was thought to be a better choice, so they made her head of some obscure agency called the Commodity Futures Agency, right? She was there when Bill Clinton did the great sellout. You all know Bill Clinton's great sellout, right? I say great because that's how we got the Great Recession. Come on, I gave that lecture here. Where were you? You didn't take notes? That's what the Great American Stick-Up was all. Bill Clinton made the alliance with Phil Gramm of the Republicans when he was president. That was his triangulation to reverse Glass-Steagall, destroy all the sensible rules of the New Deal to prevent commercial and investment banks from being together, and to deregulate Wall Street. And he brings in this Ghanaf, Robert Rubin from Goldman Sachs, to be his Secretary of Treasury, right? And that's the alliance between the Democrats and Wall Street. All this is going to circle back to Trump, so bear with me. The alliance, right? The end of populism in the Democrats starts with Bill Clinton, okay? And Bill Clinton makes this alliance with the Republicans to do something that they couldn't do on their own. On their own, they couldn't deregulate Wall Street. Why? Because we'd already had a warning called the savings and loan scandal. A lot of people have been hurt. Okay? Now, good old Ronald Reagan, and I'll probably lose the people I don't lose with my Trump analysis, my Reagan analysis, but Reagan also had a brain. And even though Reagan drank the Kool-Aid, even though at one point he thought, and his family thought, Franklin Roosevelt was the greatest human being ever, and his father worked for the New Deal, and Reagan in his book, The Rest of Me, pays tribute to Roosevelt for having saved his family from starvation as a kid. Reagan, as an actor, went another way, and you all know he ended up working for GE. Now, GE that Reagan visited actually happened to be GE that had the United Electrical Workers Union, and was actually an enlightened capitalist company because it had a strong union. That was the saving grace of capitalism, with strong unions, saving from themselves, right? That's what the New Deal was. So when Reagan visited every single GE plant, he did meet relatively happy workers. They were happy because they had this very strong union, later became the IUE, had their back. You got vacations. You could actually have a little fishing boat in your driveway. You could actually have some security, some promotion, some dignity, and you actually made good products. People like GE's products, right? They worked. Light bulbs, refrigerators, and so forth. So Ronald Reagan came away with an idea of capitalism as being quite enlightened, even though he was head of a union. He did a little bit of union busting and right-wing embrace and all that. And then a big shock happened to Ronald Reagan. Between the time he became president and the time he ended, you had the saving and loan scandal. And he discovered things about banking and irresponsibility and the lack of adults watching the store. And one of these was GE. And in his lifetime, GE had gone from being this fairly admirable company to a banking shill, GE Capital. And they were making liar's loans and lousy loans. And they were making lousy refrigerators. Only lousy refrigerators weren't selling as well. Lousy loans were. And so by the time Reagan leaves office, even though he seemed to be a free market deregulator, he actually tightened regulation. Okay? All of this can be checked, as I tell my students. I could be full of shit. The great thing about the internet, if you'll just go in the hallway after my class, sit down for an hour, you'll figure out whether I'm full of shit or not. Right? It's emancipating. Maybe he made this up. Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he can't read. Okay. But the way I read the story, Ronald Reagan, at the end of his tenure, decided, hey, finance needs some regulation. He actually tightened the screws. Okay? All right? When we go through the first President Bush, he's kind of indifferent to it. And then we get Clinton. Clinton, everybody forgets, had a narrower claim on the presidency than Trump. Democrats love to point out he didn't win the popular vote. Well, come on. Clinton, remember Ross Perot, remember his percentage of the vote? So he's not doing so well. And that second election wasn't, the midterm wasn't so good. So what does Clinton do? He embraces Wall Street, okay, with a vengeance. And Robert Rubin is the prophet of this, and the Hamilton Society and all these people, and they go wild with it. And they even find support in people like Jesse Jackson, because there's some illusion it's going to help black people get homes. Right? It's going to be good for minorities. Let's lower the standards or change the standards. I'm not going to visit that whole crisis. You can go buy my book. But that's pretty much been affirmed. And it doesn't get better under Obama, who then lets these hedge funds and everything gobble up all the foreclosed homes and exploit people with a vengeance. And there's been a lot of good research. The conclusion of that whole period, by the way, it's interesting, false consciousness. The Federal Reserve of St. Louis, the most authoritative study on the consequence of the Great Recession, is that black people in America and brown people were the main victims. Black people lost 70% of their wealth, not their income, their wealth, reversing really the gains, economic gains of the Civil Rights Movement. Brown people lost 60%. They were the main victims, okay? And why? Because they were subject to these manipulative loans. And what happens to Robert Rubin after he leaves the administration? Okay? Robert Rubin works for the bank he made legal, right? Citibank, Citigroup. And that's what was an immediate need to reverse Glass-Steagall to allow Citigroup to be both investment and consumer-oriented. And then Goldman Sachs changes as they're about to go under, right? So I'm not going to go through that whole history, but it creates the preconditions for Trump and answering the symptom or cause. The fact is, you end up with a lot of unhappy people in America. And Obama gets elected, and I admit, I'm all for smashing glass ceilings, okay? And I maxed out on Obama. Even more so, I was in San Diego speaking to the ACLU, and this woman next to me at the dinner after, I said, "It's in the bag, isn't it?" She said, "No." So I bought $500 more of T-shirts, and so I still have them. I'm ashamed to wear them. But I thought, yes, it's an important victory. It was an important victory. And the good thing is he didn't need a blowjob in the White House, so we know it's okay to have a black president. If he had done what Clinton did, we'd really be in trouble. I know I'm not supposed to say if he didn't feel the need to have oral sex, well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be crude. You'll hold it against me. But the fact of the matter is, under Obama, he comes in and he makes this sweetheart deal on the bailout, and instead of mortgage forgiveness and foreclosure restraint or moratorium and so forth, all of the things that he should have done, they make Wall Street gone off whole, and everybody gets screwed. So you have a lot of unhappy people. They're not deplorables, as Hillary Clinton called them. They're people made deplorable in their economic circumstance by your husband's policies. That's what happened, a lot of them. They lost their homes. They lost their status. They had to move out of the neighborhood. Their sense of self-worth was destroyed. They're alienated. It didn't happen by accident. Yes, a demagogue of the right can play on that. Just as in Germany, right? You say, where did this funny, comical, Charlie Chaplin figure of Adolf Hitler get up boasting about big blonde Aryans? It was a caricature. And he didn't represent that in any way, but he could appeal to those big blonde Aryans because they were out of work, right? Because the Marx didn't buy. Oh, thank you. Have I said anything to alienate you yet? No. Evidently not. Okay.
You don't know what you're drinking.
So, that's what demagogues feed on. They feed on the alienation, misery, and so forth. Okay? So, if we want to look at symptom and cause, we have a very unhappy society. All right? And I'm just only mentioning one or two so far. Immigration is a legitimate cause of concern on a number of levels, okay? We've never had leadership on this question to convince people that the immigrants are good for you rather than bad. They are objectively raise your standard of living. No question about it, okay? That's how you eat. That's how your children get raised, okay? That's how your lawn gets cut, all right? Everybody knows that. You can't live in California or Texas and not know that. You know, you people have been exploiting immigrants since you were here. Come on, give me a break. You know, and I could learn that argument in any bar in Orange County when I lived there. It was so obvious, okay? That movie, A Day Without a Mexican, where would you start? All right, okay? But you wouldn't have a sensible policy about it. And the issue is not wall or no wall, or electronic wall or real wall. The question is, should people have to risk their lives going through the desert and dying and being raped and being exploited and blackmailed, or do you have a sensible means of admitting and not admitting people? Also, will you do anything to improve the economy of the home country? You've destabilized Central America. You haven't done anything for Mexico except get them involved in this crazy drug wars, destroy the fabric of the society. You know? And by the way, one little plus for Trump, okay? One little plus for Trump, his rewrite of NAFTA, even without the Democratic input, is a considerable improvement. Not a minor improvement, as Bernie Sanders, who I much admire, said, a considerable improvement over the original NAFTA. The original NAFTA had no protection for workers' pay. The new one says 40% of the pay on parts of cars being brought in Mexico or anywhere else have to be $16 an hour. a considerable breakthrough. If we would put that in the China trade agreement, I don't know how the hell it got in there, or the rights to use local courts instead of company courts on union issues, the rights of unionization, environmental protections, the improvement. It's an improvement. Have you heard one person on MSNBC ever say that? Or why didn't the Democrats get rid of NAFTA or change it or have more sensible trade agreements? Okay? And I can see people are going to get angry. Where is he going? I tell my students, you know, life is not linear. Issues are not linear. They're interrelated. Sorry. I got to dig the ground a little bit before I put the seed in, all right? And the reality is, on all of these issues, there's another story. Did you really want to solve it, or are you exploiting it? Okay? Even abortion. Let me alienate a few people right now. The sensible answer, abortion is a shitty procedure. My mother had 3 of them before me. So I'm one of those people I've always thought was Margaret Sanger right? Margaret Sanger, who actually explicitly said people like my mother should not have children. She can't provide for them. She's unmarried, right? She's a low-paid worker. We don't need more of them. Now, fortunately, you hadn't invited me here. If you listen to Margaret Sanger, I wouldn't be here. Okay? Abortion has never been a wonderful solution. Rare, careful, blah, blah, blah. We've always known birth control, family planning, education. Not don't say no, but responsibility would be a much better way to do it. The easy argument, frankly, is Roe versus Wade. And I'm not indifferent to this issue. I was married to a woman who I had, before I knew her, I took her to Mexico. She has written about it, and I was not the father. I know what the old days were like. She was bleeding on the way back. I'm not going to go into the details, but we both discussed it. I know the old days. I know the coat hanger. You know, I know what my mother must have gone through to have her abortions as a poor woman. I'm not glorifying it in any way. I'm not minimizing it. But I wonder, why are we always stuck on that procedure, and so little has been said about the ways of making abortion rare? Education, active, you know, family planning, responsibility, sex without, you know, birth, you know, instead of the puritanical just say no. Okay, so on all of these issues, there's another scenario you could be following if you are really serious. You know, whether it's terrorism, yes, there's terrorism. There's always been terrorism. Do you get at it by going to the wrong country and invading it? The one country in the world where bin Laden and al-Qaeda could not operate was Iraq. All of the best and the smartest knew that. They knew, right? Saddam Hussein was a sworn enemy of these religious fanatics, just like Assad in Syria is. Yet we demonize them, okay? Doesn't mean they're virtuous. But the fact of the matter is you're not serious about solving the problem. If you care about terrorism, right, you don't support al-Qaeda in the first place, because they're the freedom fighters that are going against the Russians. You don't demonize a guy named Nabajuli, who was the first secular guy, or undermine the king, who was certainly, you know, Afghanistan was not a horrible place. Women were making advances earlier. So if you're serious about any of these problems, whether it's the economy, or you could talk about income distribution, guaranteed, a lot of things you could talk about. You can be in favor of robots, but then let's talk about retraining. Let's talk about job security. Let's talk about, again, guaranteed health care. You know, you can make changes economically, you know, that are good, rational. Nobody's ever going to justify assembly line work if you can replace it, but share the rewards. Guarantee, that's what the basic argument for guaranteed Medicare, you know, health care for everyone should be. It should be a human right. And if it's a human right, you don't have to hold on to the lousy job to get some medical care. Okay? And if you have a guaranteed annual income, so you lose your job, you're still going to have the basis of life. Okay? Then you can do robotics and so forth. All right? So in any of these issues, the real question is, do you have adults watching the store? And I'm here to argue that Donald Trump is the logical, natural, and expected outcome of bipartisan politics in this country. That's my argument. Okay? That doesn't exonerate him. Doesn't mean a lesser evil candidate would be preferable. I'm not going to get into all that. I voted for lesser evil people all my life, and they turned out to be horrible. I'll probably fall for the trap again, but that's not the critical conversation. Joe Biden, for instance, is heart and soul connected with the major problems we had. Heart and soul. He was there for the economic deregulation. He was there for the bailout of Wall Street. He was there for the lousy wars, the forever wars. He was there for starving the programs of decency to help the cities, help poor people, and so forth. It's all there. You know, I don't need Bernie Sanders. What I love about Bernie Sanders is I love it when old Jews from New York are made mainstream. It's great. You know, I mean, I think this guy is terrific, and he's the only one, you know, I'm not going to get into that. Look, you know, one thing I've learned, you'll make your own decisions. Let me just flush this out. So symptom or cause? All right, let's go down that list. Donald Trump did not invent a single one of these problems, nor did he seriously advance them, okay? Yes, it's terrible dividing families at the border. What do you think happened to families before? You think it was gentle? You think when they were separated? I was in the desert. I saw what happens when the Border Patrol went with their flashlights and there were children and so forth. What do you think they did? They read them their rights? You know, you think they didn't separate them? You think bad things didn't happen? You didn't think there was rape or corruption or stealing their money or violence, right? What did you think about the border all these years when you had that Mexican woman working for you, cleaning your toilet? You know, what did you think? Did you ever ask any questions about it? Okay? So none of these issues. You know, we can do the calculation. What's more dangerous? Like people say, oh, it's terrible. We have an article in Truthdig by Bill Blum saying, oh, this is impeachable, another impeachable. He took out this guy in Iran, the general, right? And terrible guy. So yes, it's terrible. It's assassination. We have never assassinated anyone? Are you kidding me? Do you ever hear about John Kennedy getting the mob, to get the mob in Havana to supply Castro with the cigar that would blow up? Or the pen that would explode? What do you read? Have you never read any of these reports? Do you really think this is the first? And who started the drone? You want to stop me off? No. 5 minutes. Well, you get your money's worth. Who do you think started? Barack Obama sat around every morning. Who are we going to kill today? Didn't he? Did I invent this? Where did the drone program come from? You don't care? It's only bad when Trump does it? You know? I mean, you go down the line. Oh, yeah, terrible thing that he did to the Kurds. Who's ever been kind to the Kurds? Who ever gave a damn about the Kurds? Everyone always used the Kurds. Do you really think it's much worse under Assad? Then why did they go along with the deal? Was it really a good time to be living right on that border with Turkey? Don't they still control their area? What was Hillary Clinton's role? I mean, what did Hillary Clinton do about Syria? Have you internalized that one? Syria is relatively stable now. Life is coming back. Do we thank the Russians? Right? You could probably get hung for thanking the Russians, right? Right? Didn't they help stabilize it? They did bad things, yes. But isn't Syria, oh no. What did Hillary Clinton do? She decided that destabilizing Syria would be a good thing for human rights. And as a result, you had this massive flood of refugees destabilizing Europe and everywhere else. People dying in the sea. There's no accountability is what I'm trying to say. So the great feeding fest on Trump is we have this obviously obnoxious, arrogant, goofy, madly egotistical, probably is a lousy businessman. You know, maybe even beats his children, but they seem to like him. I don't know. You know, demonizing people is a really easy game, okay? But the thing you have to face in life, even at this age, is why do good people do most of the bad stuff? That is really the sad lesson of our modern history. The Beatles are in the safest place because they don't pretend or claim or act as if they're overly smart. Being smart becomes an excuse for dangerous mischief, for rationalization. I'm sorry. It's a hell of a thing to tell people who've come out to hear me talk, and I'm trying to make you a little bit smarter. But that's the most depressing lesson of the whole Trump experience. And actually, we've seen some positive things. We've seen some revitalization of an independent press, you know, some questioning. I've never before gone to AP or the New York Times and find every other paragraph contradicting what the president said on a national security question. They didn't do it for George W. Bush. Did the New York Times ever question Bush's thinking about going into Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction? They didn't. I'm sorry. Individual reporters occasionally, the paper editorially supported it. And most of the reporting, remember Judy Miller? The weapons are there. They'll find them. Okay? The LA Times supported it. Right? You had a few nuts down there in Leisure World opposing it. You know, I remember one of the rare places you could come. I wrote a book with my son, Christopher, The 5 Biggest Lies Bush Told Us About Iraq. And everywhere else I got all these criticisms. No, this war is necessary. It was only Leisure World where I heard, why only 5 lies? I tried selling my book here. The fact of the matter is, American presidents have lied about every key aspect of foreign policy as long as one can remember. That's why George Washington warned us about the impostures of pretended patriotism. That's why it's been said truth is the first casualty in war. That's why the national security state is such a menace. You can lie with impunity, consistently, over time. The truth doesn't ever catch up. Trump is not the most offensive liar. He's not the most aggressive foreign policy president, and he has not done the most damage. Sorry. Now, having said that, I'm frightened to death of a second Trump term. I am, because then he is truly unleashed. I'll give you that one. And Noam Chomsky, to quote him fairly, feels I'm not properly alarmed, sufficiently alarmed. He feels, and you should read the interview, he takes issue with me. If you want a different view, and Truth Dig tomorrow morning, and Chomsky feels he's in an unusual time, and that Trump is out of control, and will break the barrier, and that really frightening things happen. I'm not here to settle that debate, okay? And I assume the anti-Trump candidate will sweep even Orange County, right? Because Orange County has now become a pinko haven. But anyway, my point is different. My point is the problems are not going to go away. They're going to be made worse. Why? One, we have been living, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take a few more minutes on this. We have been living in the most powerful, most violent, most destructive empire in human history, and we never have been willing to call it by its name. It is camouflaged, it is protected, it is rationalized with all kinds of language about freedom and everything else. But never in the human experience has so much concentrated power been identified with nationalism, national purpose, greed, corporate influence, everything else. Serving yourself. It's why most of the clothes you were made here were made in China. And any gadget you're using was made in China. And if not in China, some other low-wage area. And all the bullshit about whether this trade agreement is fair or not, or China, is really whether the Chinese can escape the Industrial Revolution and move to a higher stage of development. Right now, 4 of the 10 top internet companies happen to be Chinese-owned. And they're privately owned, by the way. And yet we accuse them of being puppets of their government, or influenced by their government, or stealing, as if no Chinese person can do math. You know, I mean, really. Or science, or anything. All right? The fact is, they're better at it than us. They have more engineers than we do, and they will have many more. And so will India. You know, and Brazil is another contender. This American-centric view of the world is the most dangerous notion that we've developed in the last 60, 70 years. It is absurdly dangerous, conceited. Think about it. And yet it's seen as something pleasant, you know, as something charming. And it's brutal. It's powerful. It's destructive. It levels, you know, the carpet bombing of Vietnam. Korea, we destroyed every single structure in Korea. And we had no purpose in Korea other than to send a signal to the Chinese communists who just come to power across the border. It had nothing to do with human rights or freedom or anything, but we destroyed every single building in what was in Korea, north and south. All right? So we have been the most reckless, dangerous force by virtue of the extent of our power, the ferocity of our weapons, the arrogance of our illusions, you know, and what makes it most dangerous, just to bring it back to Huxley and Orwell, is the conceit that drives it, the pretense and the adoption of the slogans of freedom and self-determination for purposes that stand quite in opposition to it. Now, I want to leave with one last point of warning, okay? When we think about the fascist threat, the totalitarian threat, and the way one focuses one's attention these days is by a lot, and I haven't even talked about global warming, okay? And what Chomsky argues is really has a threat to end the species in real time. And he points out most species last for 100,000, we've lasted 200,000, and we're probably doomed. I just want to make one little point about global warming. Right now, the focus is on, let's get China to stop burning coal, right? Or let's get these other folks. When I was in graduate school in Chinese studies, by the way, at Cal, the statistic that we used then was that China had somewhere between 400 and 500 million people. They had no real energy resource, they had no petroleum, they had coal. Their land was exhausted, they were grossly overpopulated, and they could never make it economically. They now have about 900 million more people. They still don't have petroleum. But China has actually followed a capitalist model of exploitation and expansion, of trade deals all over the world, of producing products that people want, of manufacturing, admittedly more on a lower level, but increasingly quite sophisticated. The new Teslas are being made in China. And what is needed, the best thing you can do to avert dramatic climate change is to have the poorer people cut in on the spoils in ways that are less destructive of the environment. That's a choice we did not make. When I was in graduate school, thanks to people like Ehrlich and others who wrote The Population Bomb, we used the statistic all the time that we in America were 6% of the world's population and we consume 60% of its resources. If you want to know where the climate problem came from, it came from that statistic. We are the ones who took the world on this wild consumer ride. We are the ones that spent with abandon. We are the ones who consume without restraint. That's where it started. We are the ones that convinced people you could have more and more and more and more. And we got the rest of the world to strip their trees, exploit their land, get their young people to work in our factories under unsafe conditions so we could consume with such abandon. Now, I'm going to end with a cheerful dystopian note. And Chomsky, by the way, the headline on this piece, which I'm proud to say by now 100,000 people have read on Tuesday, so it's not mass media, but it's a nice start. And then I don't know how many more have listened to it on KCRW, and hopefully you'll be people who will go there. But the headline on the piece is the U.S. responsibility for world dystopia, that we are creating a world dystopian society in which people will be managed to go along with what they should not go along with. So I want to end with you, give you a homework assignment. and reread, because I'm sure you've read it many times, both 1984 and Brave New World. And the interesting thing is they hold up two apparently different models of dystopia. I think we can all agree we're heading to a dystopian future. That's the good thing about Trump. He's made it very clear. We're heading to a dystopian future. For the United States to have a president like Trump, we're very close, right? The American people have embraced this guy, many of them anyway, whether it's 45%, 50, whatever. All right. One model of this dystopian society is the brute force model, 1984, right? The other is the manipulative model, right? Brave New World. Conning people, spectacle, sports, amusement, consumerism, and so forth, two models. So when Huxley's book was written in 1931, in response to the Roaring Twenties and everything, Huxley's was 1949. By a coincidence, Huxley had been Orwell's French teacher at Eton. So the publisher had this great idea. Both books were bestsellers, will be bestsellers. So they wrote a letter and sent Orwell's 1984 to Huxley. Huxley wrote back a letter, which you could find on the internet, that is quite revealing. He said, I still think my book is the better take. He said some nice flattering things about his former student Orwell. He said, but I don't think it's going to be the nail fist. I don't think it's going to be the Gestapo or the brute force. He said, I think it's going to be the model I had. The hidden persuasion, the advertising, the manipulation, the consumption, and so forth. It's a very interesting exchange. And when we talk about totalitarianism, fascism, we talk about Trump, we stress a harsh view. But Trump was not given to us by an armed coup. He was given to us by television. Trump, Les Moonves at one point, before he lost his job over alleged harassment, should have lost his job over something he said during the election. He was the head of CBS. He said, Donald Trump may not be good for the country, but he's great for CBS. Meaning he was good for the ratings. Trump is the logical product of Huxley's society. He's not particularly a militarist. He's not particularly into conquest. He's actually shown some restraint. The Democrats now are actually more of a warmongering force than Trump. They're more interventionist, generally, not Bernie Sanders, but some of the others. They're more super patriotic. So I think we should keep in mind what this tension is, and that one could move into a dystopian. Maybe we're already there. Maybe we already are the unfree claiming to be free. Maybe we've been conned. Maybe we're part of a play that we have nothing to do with writing or acting out. So I'll leave you with that cautionary note, and if we still have time, have questions. Thank you.
So we're going to do Q&A now, actually CQ&A. You know what the C stands for? Comments, right. But keep them short, keep them under a minute. Q&A, we're here to hear Bob and not you, with all due respect. Keep them short. If you line up here and in back of this, and this is Bob's latest book. We have several dozen of them set up at that table over there, and whether he knows it or not, Bob is going to sit down and sign them.
Okay.
And it is, they know everything about you, how data collecting corporations and snooping government agencies are destroying democracy.
Yeah, and let me say, by the way, I didn't know we were going to do this, but don't pay any more than the Amazon price, okay?
Well, I've been told to say $30.
No, it's too much, too much. Somebody will look.
We have a discount.
Really, look whatever it would cost you, because I buy them myself on Amazon.
Make a price, 26?
20 is good.
What can I do?
It's a bargain, and you get a signature. It's a good book.
Keep your comments short. One more quickie. We passed legislative action a couple of weeks ago, but Nancy Pelosi screwed it up by delivering the articles to the Senate. But you can still call your senators and urge a full, fair, free, impartial trial with witnesses and documents. Okay, go.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed this speech, and I've read your book, and it's excellent. I'm a proud supporter of Truth Dig, and I know how independent journalism is really financially stressed, so I'm hoping that people will do whatever they can to support you, because your voice is very important. And I especially enjoy the columns by Major Daniel Jerson about current events and his experience in the military and his teaching at West Point. So I want to encourage people to do what they can to support you guys.
Thank you. Let me answer a question that you asked me at lunch. You asked me, what do I think about the billionaire model of journalism, basically, because the LA Times, now owned by a local billionaire pharmaceutical guy, and the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, and as a personal chump change thing that he bought, yet he's a big military contractor. I'm not going to keep it short. I think it's a very dangerous model. And right now, the model for journalism is broken. The internet destroyed it, targeted advertising. They can get the readers of the New York Times without ever placing an ad. That's a big theme of my book. And so we really don't have a sustainable model of journalism. That's why we started Truth Dig, but it's very difficult. It's hard to pay people enough to pay their rent, so put it out there.
Yeah, so another old Jewish guy from the Bronx, I went to D with Clinton, but Christopher Columbus was okay. So, first of all, I was concerned, but I really appreciate you.
Are you from Marshallou Parkway?
No, I lived on the Grand Concourse.
Oh, I'm sorry, beg your pardon. Go ahead.
I really appreciate your objectivity about really what this country has been about. I don't hear enough people talking about the things that you talked about. I thought it was really very informative and very honest, and I appreciate it. But here's my question. You said you were concerned about, what would happen if Trump gets reelected. I hope he gets reelected. That will make me a friend of the people here, But I am concerned about, as soon as he was elected, the Democrats immediately started their impeachment war, and they've made life miserable ever since then. And I'm concerned about what will happen during a second Trump term, and what's going to happen in this country. And I'm really, really concerned about the divisiveness. It can't seem to get any worse, but I'm sure it could. And so, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think it's going to, I don't think the Senate is going to support this. I do think it would be reckless. I think it would embitter a large part of the electorate to think that elections don't really work. And I honestly do not think the charges against Trump rise to a level that would exclude just about every other president. I think if you go ahead and impeach Trump over the charges that have been raised, I think you could easily convict every single post-war president. And some of them who engage, for instance, let's begin with Harry Truman, to drop the bomb and support it. But every one of those wars here, finally the Democrats say Congress has to approve a war. That hasn't happened once since the Second World War. So what are we talking about? I think it is a dangerous precedent. And I think the best way to defeat him is at the polls. And even though it's a very flawed system, the fact is the Democrats seem to be much better at getting money than the Republicans these days. They're not starved for funds. Anyone else? Yeah.
Excellent presentation, sir.
Thank you.
I listened to you on KCRW. I have 3 words that would sum up why he gets elected. Quid pro quo. Think about that. That's why he was elected. He has people, when you get up for election, I've been up for election for minor things. People question me, say, what if this comes up? What if that comes up? What if this comes up? And they must have, this intelligent committee that must have sat with him, they must have asked him these questions, and yet he still got in. So my thing is, people, quid pro quo, money pays for everything. I come from England, and you know what we call a pound in England? A quid. Here's a quid, and when we get a quid, we have to do something for that quid.
Yeah.
And that's how our president got in.
Well, okay, I'm trying to give a 3-word answer. I don't have it. I'll just say there are a lot of, we have this argument. I live in a high-rise downtown, okay? We have this argument in the morning. And at the end of the argument, I have to point out to my wife that some of her best friends in our building not only voted for Trump, but plan to vote for him again, okay? And then, I'm sorry, you're grown, and then they give back answers that are not outrageous. Their 401ks didn't shrivel. They're on fixed income. What damage has he done that they've seen? Now, admittedly, they live in California, not elsewhere. And I do think the Democrats are underestimating that vote, that silent vote. The other thing is, I think the Democrats are counting on Wall Street and big hedge fund owners to bail them out, and because they're getting money. That's really the strategy. After Robert Rubin left the Clinton administration, right? They brought in Lawrence Summers. When Barack Obama defeated Hillary Clinton in the primary, he brought in Lawrence Summers. This flirtation with Wall Street, unless it's a Bernie Sanders, maybe Elizabeth Warren, but without the two of them, you can't trust a single Democrat on that stage, even on the remaining, to not cave into Wall Street. If you think then, okay, I'm depressed by it. Because if you think about it, you take on the average person, unemployment is down, right? Your job security is a little better. Hiring of people is better. I mean, you go right down the list, and you say, wait a minute, are these people really going to care more about our issues? And when you're some county fair or something, I've been there as a reporter. And are they going to really trust Joe Biden at that stage to care more about him? Where was he before? And I think that's why Hillary Clinton didn't work. I think at the end of the day, people felt too many people thought they were deplorable. But what they really were was stressed over their circumstance.
Just had a comment or question on the sorry state of the news media. I'll give the press, the printed press, I'll give the printed press a pass because they're using their own ink and their own paper. They're buying and selling. But the electronic press is using the public airwaves, which are limited, and it's really not balanced. If you come from some gentlemen, I'll a little bit here.
Do you want a yes or no?
No. I want a comment. But okay. What they're trying to do now is eliminate internet. Oh, okay. They're trying to eliminate the government is trying to eliminate the internet press.
Yeah. Okay. I get your take.
Okay.
I think your point is an important one.
Yeah. But what they're doing, the government cannot eliminate the printed press, the internet press, because they cannot censor. However, what they're doing now is they're blackmailing the people on the internet and going after them on other grounds other than the publication. But really, the important thing is the
Okay, I think I could take your point and expand on it. I think journalism is in trouble. It was never perfect. The free press that the founders enshrined was a free press that we could all do. Certainly all white males with some income could do. All right, let me not glorify it too much. But it was, if you had access to a printing press, if you could make a wall poster, if you could be the town crier, you could have press. You could reach people. Obviously, over the centuries, with the concentration of media, wealth has an outside influence. That wealth was checked in the market sector by the need to capture eyeballs, readers, to sell stuff to. There was a restraint. The internet broke the restraint. You can reach those consumers without going through the product, without placing an ad in the LA Times. The LA Times is now a shriveled relic of itself, through no fault of its excellent reporters. What you're alluding to in the question, one aspect is, the internet has been an alternative. You eliminate net neutrality, and you basically cut the heart out of what's been good about the internet. That is one of Trump's big crimes, by the way, appointing these people to the FCC. And the internet right now remains a pretty powerful check, for good and bad, but pretty powerful, with a lot of access, a lot of bandwidth. That can be destroyed. We've seen in more overtly totalitarian societies, they can pull the switch. So in Egypt, boom, there is no internet when people are rebelling against the military. In China with Hong Kong, and so forth. So the internet is a fragile, it was created by the government, by the way. We blame the Chinese for having government. Internet's a creation of the Defense Department to have a resilient means of communication in the event of all-out nuclear war. But in other ways also it's fragile. And the governments can pull the switch on it. They can. So it is quite alarming how we're going to communicate.
Yes, that's actually what I wanted to address. This is the first time that I've heard a variety of ideas put together, because most everything now comes in small packages. And to me, Trump is Twitter. And people who use Twitter are twits. People who cannot communicate in more than a small number of things, and they can't talk about what you've been talking about, which is a variety of different historical facts, things that are different points of view, and that's what I worry about with the internet, because it, as far as I can see, it's a lot like the oceans. There are vast floating pollutants out there, and it's very hard to find sources that are good. Of course, we here have a local newspaper which, I won't ask the question right away, but it relates to, we have a newspaper that quotes a lot of sources that are dubious, or they are politically funded study groups. Which is the Orange County, I guess it's Southern California News Group now. But the question really is, do you see any hope that the internet really can expand this, because it seems to have more falsehoods in it than it does truth, and we have to come up with new ways to find and check what is truth.
Yeah, I basically disagree with that. With all due respect, I will say the internet is the best and worst of all worlds, yes. Horrible attacks on people, and stalking them, and crimes, and falsehoods, and racism, and homophobia, and, can be spread on the internet, and with great reach and damage. On the other hand, it can be countered by others with alternative visions and values, with great, like for instance, Chris Hedges, who was fired by the New York Times. Chris Hedges is the most important journalist we have in the United States, bar none. Okay, I say it, you don't have to agree, but if he's not the most important, he's certainly one of the top 50. Hope you know who Chris Hedges is, maybe you don't. Chris Hedges covered war for the New York Times for over 20 years, all over, Mideast, Europe. Chris Hedges, look him up. He's written best-selling works. He's won lots of prizes. He writes for Truthdig. The reason he writes for Truthdig is after he gave a speech at a college back east at a graduation, critical of our war policies, the New York Times gave him an ultimatum not to give any more speeches. And so he quit. And he now writes for us. And we reach millions of people with his columns because the internet is elastic. People in China can read it. People can translate it all over the world. They read it northern. I look at night. I can see who's coming. And there's always thousands of people coming from all over the world. More from Canada, more from the United States. But the fact, and we're not alone. There are lots of outlets like that. So I say, in this stage with basically still net neutrality, still having openness, the fight to keep the internet, whether it's in China or in Egypt or here, free of government blocks and censorship and expenses and so forth, is an important fight. But let me challenge this remaining group, this remnant, about the past, the good old days. When I was a kid, 10 years old, the St. Louis Cardinals won the World Series against the Red Sox. And I, for some perverse reason, probably my radicalism from my mother's milk or something, I was a Cardinal fan. I didn't want to be a Yankee fan because they were imperialists, they always won. I couldn't support the Dodgers because they were from the loathsome Brooklyn. So for some reason I went for the Cardinals. I did not know, nor did anybody I knew, know that the Cardinals, being the most southern team, were also the most racist. I didn't anticipate that my hero of the 46 World Series, Enos Slaughter, who hit the home run, in the park home run, would spike Jackie Robinson, who was playing first base, going around first base. That the Cardinals would let out black cats, one in Philadelphia in that movie. That the team was solidly racist. That it was rooted in the reality of the American experience. I didn't know as a kid that our armed forces in the Great War for Freedom were segregated. I'd never been told that. I didn't know lots of things. The New York Times didn't tell me, right? The Herald Tribune didn't tell me. Radio stations didn't tell me. It was quite late in the day where they ever discussed class differences in America. The role of women, the history of women was not told. Certainly the history of our imperial adventures and contradictions was not told. And so what I find among my students, and I wouldn't call it cynicism, sometimes it's despair. They know they've been had. They do know, and here I'll defend USC, we have quite a few scholarship students, more than at your beloved UCLA, and my wife was the editor of the Bruin, and I did do my graduate work in Berkeley. But the fact is, being a private school, we have evidently a lower per capita income of our parents, not the ones who bribed their way in. We have a lot of outreach in the community, and at least in our student body, and I've been there for over 20 years, teaching large classes, I find increasingly our students are critical of the way things are. They're worried about the kind of jobs they're going to get. They don't believe in the American dream. And I'll tell you, my biggest political education came in the last election. I thought Bernie Sanders, who I've known about or known my whole life, I thought was going to get 1% of the vote in the primaries. I never imagined. And then I started seeing, because the students open their computers, all of which are made in China, and they open the cover, and I look at what's on their cover. I never once saw a Hillary sticker on the cover of a computer at USC. Never once. I never saw a Republican sticker. Almost all the stickers were Sanders. It started with 1, 2, 3, and by the time the election was there, it was almost every kid was a Sanders supporter. Now maybe I'm exaggerating, my polling is not scientific, but this is my experience. It has continued to now. Now there are people who support Elizabeth Warren as well. I haven't heard anybody support Joe Biden, or the Democratic establishment. So I am not down on this generation, but I'm not naive about them. I know they have to find jobs. I know that they'll burn out. I know they'll get cynical. I know their parents are giving them a hard time. What was it all about? And they could also go for a demagogue at some point. A demagogue of the right, maybe. Or racism, right? That's what scapegoatism is all about. It's a refusal of a society to face its real problems. So you find a scapegoat. And Trump is only the most obvious manifestation of it. But some are much more effective in doing this. Much more effective. You know, and we've had him as president.
Can I get my question?
Yeah.
Number one, my name is Dr. Matwani. I'm here in the winter
Microphone close to your mouth,
Okay,
please.
my name is Nalini Matwani. I'm a scientist trained in this country, and I totally do not agree with you that, number one, Trump, I absolutely enjoyed your whole discussion, so that's good. But Trump did not get elected without Russia help and Facebook help. I don't care what anybody says, it's proven. I'm a scientist, so I'm not just taking clues from everywhere. Number two, I do agree that things he's doing is good, but why would you want to destroy the environment right now and roll back, which is going to be bad for his grandchildren and our grandchildren? And that is my biggest thing. Everything else, I don't care. But environment is a real threat. I'm not saying that you stop eating meat. That's not what I eat meat. But the point is, you need to realize we are going to go there. So why not? I mean, we already have
No,
that is the worst thing. Thank you.
Okay, but if you hold on to the mic for a minute, we could have, no, you don't? Okay. I mean, I don't want to do this top down. I think these are legitimate questions, and they should be explored scientifically. If the election really, I guess what you're saying is that the manipulation of Facebook and Google, yeah, I don't think scientific inquiry into that so far has supported that assumption that it was of decisive significance. I don't. I don't think the evidence of how the election was lost is in any way compelling. The numbers are quite small. The impact is quite small. I'm quite familiar with internet numbers. I work in that environment. And when somebody tells me 100,000, as I just did, go to something, that's not going to turn an election. And Huffington Post, which I used to write for, claimed 110 million people would read me. I rarely ran into one who had, but I'm assuming those figures are real. So internet numbers are kind of, from a scientific point of view, quite unreliable. But taking the numbers that have been supplied, I don't think you can make a strong case that the election was altered by outside agitators of any kind. And I would say when it comes to altering elections, the tricks that the US government has and US agencies have far exceed that of any foreign player to interfere, far. So if we think about, say, the Russian election or the Egyptian election and so forth, the ability of US agencies, and there are plenty of whistleblowers who have told us this, Snowden is only one, that our interferences, the world class and the others, are quite low. However, I'm worried about putting pressure on Google and Facebook to patrol the internet. And I'm also worried about the charge because you can get rid of people you don't like. And I don't want Google or Facebook being the aggressive enforcer of what gets up and what gets pulled down on the internet. I don't like that mechanism. And yes, you're absolutely right. The internet is a pretty wild, I said it before, it's the worst and best of all worlds, but I like its, at the moment, unregulated quality. And I'm competing in that game, and as I say, I think, well, you wouldn't have Sanders having the popularity he does were it not for the internet. That's how young people are finding him. You know, that's how they're checking out sources. So I'm not saying it's a closed question. And what was the second one?
Environmental.
Okay. Now here you're making an absolutely important criticism of my talk. Okay. Actually, I was planning to make that the center of my talk, and I screwed up. Okay. And I agree with what Chomsky said in my interview. It is the ball game. I think nuclear war is also a ball game, but let's put that over there for a side. However, I don't think the solutions and the energy that has been put behind it is clarifying. That's why I stress consumerism. I stress different models of economic development. You cannot expect the rest of the world that is trying to catch up to do the main sacrificing. To my mind, it's interesting, the New York Times, Andrew Sorkin, who I think is an apologist for the banks, I brought his thing though. Today he has a thing in the New York Times summarizing the winners and losers of the China trade deal, okay? And he has farmers are winners, but they're also losers, and this, okay. He doesn't mention the Chinese people. I mean, it's an interesting thing. You have a trade agreement with a country that's supposed to house almost 1.4 billion people, and there's no mention of whether they win or lose. We know in NAFTA, the Mexican people and even the Canadian people lost. Okay, we hope it's going to be improved. But this trade agreement, right, are they going to eat better? And part of their living better, are they going to have air they can breathe? Because their economic model is threatened by climate change. No place in the world is clearer than China. Right now, China is the pioneer in solar, electric vehicles, getting off fossil fuel, okay? Why wouldn't you, in a trade agreement, reward that, right? And instead, we punish them for it. They say they sell solar panels too cheaply, undermining our market. Well, why is that bad? If they can make solar panels cheaper, why is that bad? They make clothes cheaper when we buy it. If they can, the only reason I drive a Bolt, electric Bolt with a B, I love it. It doesn't have the snob appeal of the Tesla, but I love it. I have to fight my wife over it. The only reason I have a Bolt is because China is demanding electric vehicles. And GM had to make an electric car, all electric car, in order to be in the Chinese market. And these foreign manufacturers are all required to very much boost up. And the ability to fuel the electric car in China, the network, the charging, I can't go up to 5, which I plan to do in the next week, go up to 5 from LA to San Francisco and charge my Bolt. There is not an electric charging station of any power on that route because Tesla, I think, has kept it out. I don't know how. But the fact of the matter is, we're asking people to buy electric cars, but we really haven't serviced them. We haven't made it easy. And now, yes, Trump did a terrible thing. He's cutting the subsidy for it. But I just want to say, the key thing in these discussions, I don't think Russia is the enemy, as another example. I think Russia has to be helped. You know, we shouldn't have been gloating over their economic chaos and their robber barons and everything. We should understand the reason Putin is popular is he's trying to balance the goddamn system. He's trying to feed people. And if we can't help China, Chinese population, Indian population, the Brazilian, and others get to a middle-class life, and be less dependent on fossil fuel and consume more wisely and less wastefully, you're not going to solve the climate change problem. They're not going to pull in their belts when we've kicked them off the train. That's the real issue. And so I do examine these trade agreements from that point of view, And I do applaud California being a leader in that respect, and I'm a very big supporter of Gavin Newsom for that reason. I think he's been quite terrific as a governor, and so if you want optimism, there's a sensible person. He's also a person who's taking active steps he ended the death penalty temporarily. He's taking active steps to undermine the prison industrial complex that has millions of our fellow citizens and the biggest population. There are a lot of things I didn't talk about. I should have taken more time, but they had the buses to catch. But I agree with you. I agree with the question. I should have begun with climate change, and that's what Chomsky does in my interview.
We're going to go to book sales in a minute. I'm going to give Cheryl Baker a 5-second question, you a 15-second answer, and then the great Leonard Cliff will ask the last question, whose daughter Sarah, your granddaughter, you can read in the New York Times, co-founding and contributing editor of Vox, which you should also look at.
Hi, thanks for being here. I really enjoyed your talk. I've been a fan for 40 years. More about the climate. I believe it's the most existential threat facing all of us, our humanity and our planet. But, yes, right. I am thinking about supporting Tom Stiers. I'd like to know how, if you think he's a good candidate, his viability, and so forth.
Oh, I'm not supposed to respond? Should I respond? Yes. Oh, no, I'm a Bernie Sanders, and because I do believe in shattering the glass ceiling, and because she's been very good on domestic economic issues, I would also enthusiastically support Elizabeth Warren as a genuine populist. The others on the stage, I feel, are designed to sell out. But let me say something nice about Tom Steyer. Hello? I don't want to. First of all, I don't think anybody in this room should give a damn who I tell them to vote for. You're all smart people. You all make your own decisions, and I haven't always been right. You know, I voted for Lyndon Johnson, for Christ's sake. The slogan of SDS was part of the way with LBJ. You know, think about that one. So I'm not going to lecture anybody about that. And he does say some very sensible things. Can I just say one little point? Sorry. I'll accept that climate change is the existential issue. That doesn't mean others are not. So, for instance, as part of the Russia bashing, we've forgotten about nuclear weapons. All it takes is one primitive Hiroshima-style bomb of that quality that can be delivered quite easily to Manhattan. If that had happened in 9/11, you would not have civil society in America. My view, okay? And so I think there are a number of issues. The alienation of people from the economy, the gig economy, the persistence of homelessness, to teach at a place like USC, where we are surrounded by Calcutta, you know, and the most important city in the world maybe because of trade and Asia and everything. Go to San Francisco, the center of this high-tech world. Go to the Salesforce building and see the encampment of depressed humanity around it. So that's an existential issue. But however, taking climate change as the first, most important, you cannot deal with it if you don't get out of the American, what's the right word for it? America's hooked on consumerism. We define freedom as consumerism. Whether it's the auto, whether it's suburbia, whether it's indefinite expansion, that is our religion, that is our ethos, that's everything about us. My students, the threat to me and my students is not that one of them is going to have a different view about the economic policy, is that they're shopping. Okay? No matter what urgency, whatever fact, whatever interest I put into it, they are contributing to climate change by buying more junk than they need. That's the reality. They're buying faster cars, bigger cars, more junk. So, you know, it's a feel-good thing to say, I'm very worried about climate growth. But are you worried about the real waste that we create for the whole world? We have a culture of waste. That's what we are. The American empire has promoted waste more effectively than any human experiment on Earth. We are the inventors, we have stoked it, we celebrate it, and we call it freedom. One more.
First of all,
I say when we get to lower than 3 people, we leave. Yeah. All right.
First of all, I come from a journalistic family. My son spent 30 years in it. My daughter was with Vox.com. Now she's a reporter for the New York, my granddaughter. She's a reporter for the New York Times, so I appreciate journalism. I also agree with a lot of the remarks you made about the problems in our society, which are really serious. It's time we stopped playing mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of the all? We are not the fairest of us all. We've done a lot of bad things. Couple things I would take issue with you. One is, I do not agree with you on this bombing in the atomic bomb. If you read Charles Sweeney's testimony, I think he was the co-pilot of the second plane, you will see that as far as I'm concerned on World War II, but this was a very tough thing to do, but it was the right thing to do. I don't care to get into discussion. Secondly...
Well, you got to add a sentence.
Hang on a second.
No, you got to add...
Hang on.
But give me the sentence. Why?
I'd like to make my other point. I agree with you. The Democrats are not perfect. My take on the Trump thing is simply this. This is a man that lies. He's backed by every racist organization in the country. He puts down people who are different. That's exactly the type of a government that my generation went to war for. One of my high school buddies, a Jewish boy, is laying in a grave in Belgium. He died at the Battle of the Bulge, fighting that sort of thing. Yeah, the Democrats are not great, but Trump is totally unacceptable. In addition, he's part of the problem instead of being part of the solution. I agree with you. The problems in this country are much deeper than Trump. But he's exacerbating them, and he's part of the problem instead of being part of the solution. And by the way, I respect what you've done in your journalism during your career. I'm sure you paid a price for it.
I'd like to respond. The reason I was cutting you off, and I didn't mean to be rude, when you say the bombing was necessary. The reason I revisit that issue is I think a lot of our problems come from that decision. And the assumption, even if you take the best case, even if you take the case, it shortened the war, and it saved lives, and even though it wasn't a military target, there was a reason for it. And even if you just deny what Eisenhower said, there was no military reason, he cautioned. If you deny what most of the science, I mean, there's a whole literature about this. I didn't just toss this off. But even if you take the case, the decision to go to a weapon that cannot differentiate between combatant and civilian, which is what the bomb is. And we've spent all of these years trying to develop more directed ones, more tactical ones, and it doesn't work. It is a weapon of such power, and it is an existential threat. Because, for instance, just one country, Pakistan, right? If they go crazy, if somebody goes crazy, you can wipe out a good part of the world's population just on their own, okay? Just on their own. If Israel gets threatened by something Iran does, they can do it. So the proliferation issue is very real, and by our demonizing Russia, which still has half of these bloody weapons, and ending any effective arms control, the nuclear issue is actually more dangerous than it's ever been. It's another topic I really couldn't visit, but that's just true. And my own feeling is our insensitivity to the other. Because, yes, we did terrible bombing in Germany. The movie Fog of War goes into all that, you know? But it's different. You could try to target it. You could make arguments. You could have logistics. You can't do that with the nuclear weapon. And I think the reason for dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was total indifference to the lives of the people who were there. That's my own view, that we would not have dropped it on Berlin. But that's a discussion we can have the next time I come back. And no, I do. And I respect what you're saying. What bothers me is not that we disagree. And I'm thrilled that you actually have read about it and care about it. What bothers me is nobody ever talks about it. They didn't talk about it then, and they don't talk about it now. You know, it's just like it didn't happen. You know, that's what bothers me. You know, and you know, yes, a few like Oppenheimer did, but not much. Yes, we have to.
I am going to.
Are you going to tell them about our 25-year relationship?
That's true.
I got tax advice from this woman 25 years ago when I visited here, and I was being ordered, I might
It's
add.
my job to say thank you for coming, and we appreciate it very much, and the meeting is adjourned.